Severe floods around the world. Why are extreme weather events becoming more common? On International Day for Biodiversity, we will take a look at what is being done to protect the planet. Hi everyone, I'm Sean Caleb, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Welcome, everyone. The southern part of Brazil is simply devastated by persistent rains and flooding over the past couple of weeks. More than 150 people have died, and more than 500,000 displaced. Flooding has also hit China, Africa, and Dubai had the highest volume of rain since official records began back in 1949. Scientists say climate change is making torrential rains more frequent around the world. We'll discuss all of this in just a bit, but first, this Wednesday marks International Day for Biodiversity, and my colleague Anand Naidu spoke with the executive director of the Amazon Watch, Leila Salazar Lopez, and began by asking her about the importance of biodiversity and preserving all forms of life on the planet.
Biodiversity is life. Life as we know it, life on our planet. It's the plants, it's the animals, it's all life. And unfortunately, we see biodiversity being threatened at all levels across our Mother Earth, across our planet. We see it threatened by extractive development, by industrial development, by deforestation, by threats to the communities that protect forests, for example. And we know that there's something that we can do about it, not only individuals, communities, and governments. Biodiversity is best protected by indigenous communities, and that's a proven fact by many numerous UN and nature studies. In fact, 80% of global biodiversity is protected by indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of our global community, our global population, yet 80% of the global biodiversity is within their lands, within their territories.
So you mentioned the role that indigenous people are playing in protecting biodiversity. Of course, in many places, the places where they live is where we get the widest range of biodiversity. But the theme for this year is be part of the plan. And you mentioned the role that other groups can play. I mean, this could be governments, this could be communities, this could be individuals. I mean, how can an individual help to protect biodiversity?
Well, yes, thank you for that question. This year is very important for biodiversity because the COP16 is taking place this year in Cali, Colombia. What is the COP? It's the Conference of the Parties for Biodiversity. That means global governments are going to be meeting in an Amazonian country, in Colombia, to make global agreements about biodiversity. 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, in Montreal, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was agreed upon. And what was agreed upon was to protect and conserve 30% of the world's terrestrial, inland water, and marine areas by 2030. And this target aims to ensure that critical habitats for biodiversity are safeguarded. It also calls for the restoration of at least 30% of degraded ecosystems by 2030. And these agreements are being put in place to protect, conserve, restore, and also prevent the extinction of known threatened species, and to improve the conservation status of at least 30% of these species by 2030. I know that's a lot of numbers.
Right.
I know that's a lot of numbers, but what I leave you with is this year, critical year for global agreements to move forward on this global biodiversity framework to protect 30% of our biodiversity, 30% of our lands, our waters, of our ecosystems, to protect global biodiversity. Now, that can only happen with our participation. we can't just leave it to governments.
Right.
We have to support and pressure our governments also to ensure that indigenous peoples are inside the COP.
Right.
They're in this conversation and this agreement. And all of us as well, not only NGOs, but civil society will also be there. And leading up to the COP, there will be many opportunities for individuals to participate and support and even, go to Cali if they're able to.
Okay. Now, we are already seeing the impact of biodiversity loss in many places. I mean, for instance, we're seeing the spread of infectious diseases, for instance, and this is among plants, animals, humans. That's speeding up. That's getting faster. What can you tell us about that?
There have been recent studies with headlines that say biodiversity loss is the biggest driver of infectious disease outbreaks. That's pretty dire to not just state, but backed up by numerous studies, the fact that biodiversity loss is actually a driver of infectious diseases. And if we think about what happened just a few years ago with the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that based on many of the studies that it was due to biodiversity loss. It was due to vector-borne diseases, vector-borne outbreak.
Right.
And so what does that really mean, backing up? Biodiversity loss can affect the transmission of vector-borne diseases like malaria, for example. We see in the Amazon rainforest, we're seeing outbreaks not only of malaria, but dengue, combined with COVID-19.
Looking at the connection between the preservation of biodiversity and climate change, I mean, Brazil has just seen some of the worst flooding in recent years in the southern part of the country. There were torrential rains there. Are we going to see more of these kinds of extreme weather patterns in the future? Can they be reversed at this stage?
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, we have seen the most devastating images and reports from Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And unfortunately, this is directly related to climate change. This is climate change in action. And it is directly related to deforestation, not only in Rio Grande do Sul, but also of the Amazon. And this is why when we talk about the Amazon reaching a tipping point, what happens when deforestation expands? It impacts the weather system, not only in the Amazon, but across South America. And the flying rivers of the Amazon, they are off course. And when they're not operating the way that they should, we see climatic impacts such as flooding, not only in Rio Grande do Sul, but also in the Amazon. We see communities in the Amazon that have been completely flooded. And then we also see, in the dry season, we see mega droughts. We're going from flooding to mega droughts. And we will see more of this if these global climate agreements and these global biodiversity are not achieved.
Leila, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to pick up right there. The flooding in southern Brazil was yet another reminder of the severity of extreme weather events linked to climate change. Our correspondent in Brazil, Paula Cabral, looked into the impact and how people are trying to adapt.
This is Eldorado do Sul, or rather it was. The entire city is now underwater, and residents have been told to evacuate, uncertain of when or if they will be able to return to their homes. This family decided to stay, fearing that looters might break in and steal their remaining belongings. However, once the water recedes, they plan to move elsewhere, as they no longer feel safe in Eldorado do Sul.
Tinha amigo meu que há 20 anos atrás ele me disse que ia acontecer isso.
A friend of mine told me 20 years ago this would happen, and we didn't believe it, but it's happening. I think it will happen because the river passes here. It goes all around. It's not the river that is off its course, it's us who are in the river. So the situation is going to get worse. We believe this is happening because of the climate situation. We are preparing to leave. We will not stay.
This climate expert says the state of Rio Grande do Sul is particularly prone to extreme weather events linked to climate change, as it's located right on the boundary between the tropical and polar zones. Too much rain won't be the only problem.
People had an idea in the past that rains were well distributed in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, but in reality, they are now concentrated in specific periods. We're going to see an increase in rainfall and, at the same time, periods of water scarcity leading to prolonged drought processes.
According to a recent government report, nearly 9 million people living in almost 2,000 Brazilian cities face a high risk of flooding and landslides. And there are growing concerns about the safety of these populations as climate change makes extreme weather events more frequent and severe. The Environment Secretary of Porto Alegre says the city is working to eliminate its carbon emissions by 2050, but acknowledges that even a successful worldwide decarbonization would not be enough to halt the climate changes already in motion.
There are a number of projects to encourage this shift in the energy matrix and transportation, and at the same time, work on the agenda of adaptation, resilience of the city. Because we are indeed going to have more and more extreme events with intense heat, landslides, storms and rains. And unfortunately, this is what we have been experiencing here in Porto Alegre, in Rio Grande do Sul.
As the latest flood in Rio Grande do Sul developed, a group of geographers used a boat and a drone to map the flooded area more precisely, to better inform rescue and relief operations in this and future events.
Então a gente tem uma imprecisão para eles saberem se precisam.
There is imprecision for them to know whether they need to go by boat or by land. In this regard, we are trying to improve the flood area, to facilitate their work. What we empirically observe and studies have proven is that we will increasingly have a sequence of events with greater intensity and frequency.
Polls show a growing awareness among people around the world about the urgency of slowing climate change. Right now, nowhere are those concerns greater than here in southern Brazil. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, Porto Alegre, Brazil.
Indeed, a lot to talk about. So let's get right to our panelist. From Sao Paulo, Gustavo Ribeiro. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. And in New Orleans, Jesse Keenan, Associate Professor of Sustainable Real Estate and Urban Planning at Tulane University. And Yixing, former Research Director at Breakthrough Energy, and he joins us from Seattle. Gustavo, I want to get right to you. I guess the danger is, after watching the flooding for weeks on end, people can get callous to it or just grow weary of seeing the pictures day in and day out. But all of southern Brazil right now is underwater, legions displaced. Bring us up to date. What do you know about the situation?
Well, we're still very far from the end of this crisis. We still have more than 600,000 people who are displaced from their homes. The governor of Rio Grande do Sul even evokes the notion that the state will need a Marshall Plan-like aid program. The government has tried to do some debt relief to the state. The state is pretty much buried in debt, which hampers also the public response. But now we are starting to see a sort of the crisis that comes after the crisis, meaning that, like you said, most of the state was underwater. That meant that hundreds of cities saw rat and insect infestation. Wow. Now we are starting to see growing cases of diseases like leptospirosis, and the health minister warns that we may find we may see a sanitary emergency after this climate emergency.
Yeah, waterborne diseases are always a huge concern in these kind of situations. But also talk about the fact that this is one of the economic linchpins for the country with its agricultural powerhouse down there right now. What are going to be the short-term concerns about that?
Yes, Rio Grande do Sul is the fourth biggest state economy in Brazil, and the state is the biggest rice producer and one of the biggest soybean producers in Brazil. There is a concern, we are still assessing the extent of the damage to the agro industry in the state. The government has lifted import levies on rice in order to control prices, because rice and beans are the staple food in Brazil, and the government worries that the crisis there may have destroyed a lot of the stock, rice stocks in Rio Grande do Sul, and the state provides 70% of the national demand for the grain. And the government worries that food inflation will also create a political problem. So it's trying to cope with, avoid a shortage of rice. And we are also seeing, we're still assessing the problems with the soybean production, because only 60% of soybean had been harvested. So we're still assessing how much of the production will be lost.
Indeed. Yixing, let's switch gears. All the way on the other side of the world, Guangdong province, home to 127 million people, simply devastated by flooding as well. Again, hundreds of thousands of people worried about where they are going to go. Talk about the situation there and the concern about the changing climate conditions. We're seeing weather patterns disrupted, the jet stream disrupted. What are people saying about that situation?
Yes, it's absolutely devastating for people who are suffering from climate change related disasters. And we really need to do a lot of work to reverse that, or at least to stop that. So first and foremost, the climate change related disasters are caused by greenhouse gas emissions. So the fundamental way to reduce this disaster is by decreasing the greenhouse gas emission through transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy resources like solar, wind, and the clean energy such as nuclear. And this transition will help stabilize the climate and reduce the frequency and severity of extreme weather events over time. So it will likely take decades, several decades, to achieve significant temperature stabilization. While it is not possible to stop climate change right away or immediately, significant progress can still be made over time, over the coming decades. So the sooner and more aggressive we act, the better we can mitigate its impact and work towards stabilizing climate for future generations. And in the short term, we still can do a lot of things to help. So we can invest in distributed energy resources, microgrid, and energy storage to make our grid more resilient and cleaner at the same time. So for distributed energy systems such as rooftop solar and home energy storage can enhance resilience by ensuring that the power supply is not entirely dependent on a single source, which could be compromised during those type of extreme weather events. And utility-scale energy storage, such as lithium-ion batteries, can provide backup power during outages caused by flooding or storms. So, and during normal operations, energy storage can help the grid to better utilize renewable energy by reducing solar and wind curtailment. So both long-term and short-term, we can do a lot to try to prevent such extreme events from happening so frequently and severely.
Jesse, picking up on what Yixing's talking about, obviously those are steps we can take right now, but the benefits, as he mentioned, are decades down the road. This carbon is going to be floating around in our atmosphere for generations, for lack of a better term. And the things that we've seen, the flooding in China, the flooding in southern Brazil, it's the norm, it seems, right now. Let's look at the information. 10 straight months of record-breaking global atmospheric temperatures, 12 consecutive months of record global average ocean temperatures. And you're in New Orleans, which sadly in the U.S. has become almost a metaphor for misery during hurricane season. People have to be worried there. The Atlantic hurricane season is predicting a very active season. And I looked at the list of hurricanes that have hit southern Louisiana, and the list is as long as my arm since 2005.
Yes, I think one of the things that we see here in the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast of the United States that is quite concerning is the extent to which the oceans are absorbing the heat from global warming, a disproportionate amount of that heat. And the question is, how much more heat can they absorb? at the upper boundaries of the ocean, that energy is translated into cyclonic energy. And what we've seen is not necessarily more hurricanes, but more intense hurricanes and more rapidly forming hurricanes. So in previous, let's say even generations, where we would have a hurricane that would slowly form and make its way into the Gulf of Mexico, and we would have maybe several days or many days or more than a week to prepare, and we could anticipate and model its intensity with some measure of precision. What we see now is the risk of very rapid intensification, where a storm, a hurricane, tropical cyclone can form and go from 0 to a category 5 in just a matter of hours in many cases. So this is the concerning part, because when a hurricane intensifies so rapidly, it puts real strains on public capacity to evacuate people, to warn people, and to make the necessary infrastructural and civil protections necessary in the face of a very rapid storm. So that's one dimension, and that's very much caught up in the energy content and the heat content trapped in our oceans.
Indeed. Gustavo, Jesse makes some really good points there, talking about the infrastructure, because right now, Brazil's talking about having to rebuild 600 cities. How is it going to do that? This is an economy that has suffered for close to 15 years now, moving forward, the people that are displaced. What is the impact of climate migration? Because we're hearing an awful lot about that these days.
Well, we're still not seeing a big wave of migration between states. What we saw is people leaving these affected areas and going to coastal cities more to the north, which were not affected. And it was described like this is not a touristic season in Brazil right now, and it had the inflow of like a touristic season, but we're still not seeing in Brazil this sort of massive migration waves. However, most of Brazil's coast faces very high levels, very high risk of floods, and this is where 55% of the Brazilian population lives. So this is something that we could see in the coming years.
Jesse, I want to come back to you quickly, because the hurricane season here in the U.S. begins in just a week on June 1st. And August 29th is now a very dark day in that region. You had Katrina back in 2005, Ida in 2021. And I want to talk about the buffers, the areas that really used to stop the storm surge, because I think everybody knows now that southern Louisiana is losing almost a football pitch worth of wetlands, every hour or so. I mean, it's really frightening, the amount of land that it's losing down there. Moving forward, is climate change making these events? You talked about them becoming more powerful, but not necessarily more rapid, but I think, or more in numbers. I think a lot of people are going to push back on that and say, when you see these counterclockwise storms push off the coast of Africa, everybody in this hemisphere gets nervous these days.
Yeah, they do, and I think it's worth addressing the buffer zones. When we look at the buffers, we know that our natural environment, our wetlands in particular, serve as historically, they're valuable ecosystem services. They are mitigating the surge and the intensity of these storms, and they do really buffer our inland populations all along the coastline globally. And we're seeing the inundation of these ecosystems challenging in terms of biodiversity, as your previous guest noted. But we're also seeing, in the case of southern Louisiana, oil and gas extraction actually accelerating the decline of these ecosystems. And we put a lot of money, we put billions of dollars into restoring these environments and actually trying to build back that land. But we're currently in an administration here within the state of Louisiana that's stepping back from those commitments. And that will have long-term implications, particularly because when we look at the region of the Gulf of Mexico, we're seeing somewhere in the order of 12 to 15 millimeters of sea level rise a year. This is more than double the global average for sea level rise. So the Gulf of Mexico being very shallow, very warm, increasingly, as we recognize, it's heating up, it's thermal expansion, and waters are essentially building up and leading to very rapid sea level rise. So it's a combination of sinking land, land loss, and rapid sea level rise that is really a terminal condition for the region.
Yixing, we had a tragic incident recently, a person dying when a plane hit severe turbulence. And according to Paul Williams, a professor in the UK, severe turbulence could double, triple in the coming decade. Now, due to climate change, this is another sign that it's here, it's real, and it's now.
Yes, absolutely. It's definitely here and it's now, and it's affecting a lot of people's life. And we talk about the more frequent and severe natural disasters, and that costing people's life. So what we should do now, I think, while building more sustainable and resilient energy infrastructure is crucial. It is not a standalone solution. We should also implement climate adaptation measures. So infrastructure improvements should be coupled with climate adaptation strategies, such as building flood defense, improving drainage systems, and enhancing stringent building codes to ensure structures can withstand extreme weathers. And in areas severely affected by climate change, where adaptation and mitigation are not sufficient, planned relocation or climate migration might be also necessary. So this is all things we have to do now.
Gustavo, not a lot of time left, about a minute and a half, but obviously one of the biggest concerns moving forward is biodiversity. And we've seen it in the coral reefs around the world that are getting bleached because of warmer temperatures. Obviously, people concerned about the rainforest. Tell me the level of concern that you're seeing in Brazil, of course, the lungs of the world, and what you believe people are going to be doing in the coming years, decades, to try and mitigate this.
No, I think there is a gap between what people think, what the government thinks, and then what Brazilian Congress thinks. 99% of Brazilians believe that what we're seeing in Rio Grande do Sul today is linked to climate change. And 2/3 of Brazilians are concerned about climate change and think climate change will worsen their lives. The government, this current government, is trying to curb Amazon deforestation. However, we have a very strong agricultural lobby in Congress, and they are trying to curtail a lot of the environmental laws that currently are enforced in Brazil. They're trying to essentially remove the teeth of environmental law enforcement in order to expand agricultural production. So this is a very conservative Congress that we have in Brazil, and we are seeing a very strong effort in order not to increase the guardrails, but actually remove them. So there is a big gap between what people are thinking and what policymakers are doing.
Indeed, and coming off the Bolsonaro administration as well, it is not easy. Something the U.S. could be facing if former President Donald Trump wins this fall, something we'll all have to watch. Gustavo, Jesse, Yixing, I want to thank all of you for your time and your insights. It's been very interesting. And that does it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Calebs in Washington, D.C. And as always, thanks for watching.